Emily Thiroux Threatt has much experience in the grieving process and has learned to face life with love, optimism, and joy. Her books include the bestseller, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and Loving and Living Your Way Through Grief. She founded the weekly online gatherings of the Grief and Happiness Alliance, where people dealing with loss write together and learn happiness practices. Emily, welcome to the show. Lovely to have you here today.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
So perhaps for those who haven't encountered your work yet, you could share a little bit about your story.
Okay. I have been, for most of my career, I've actually had lots of different jobs and things that I've done, but for most of my career, I've been a writing teacher at the university level. And so I write all the time for lots of different things. And I have had, unfortunately, two husbands who both died. I took care of each of them for 2 years before they died. I didn't know that they were sick when we got married, and they died of the same thing. And so I ended up dealing with a lot of grief and trying to figure out what I could do to help me best through that time period. And my last husband to die had lived on Maui long before I met him. And he said that that's where he really wanted to go. And I surprised myself and went along with him. We just sold the house and what we had and everything and came over here. And that last 2 years that we had here together on Maui was pretty wonderful. But after he died, I didn't know that many people because I'd been with him. I knew doctors, lots of doctors that we saw, but I didn't know that many friends or anything. So I was trying to figure out what to do. And I just started writing about it because I do enjoy writing and what I do with that. And the more I wrote, the more I saw I was writing things that I could tell somebody else who was dealing with grief, here, try writing this, and it would help them. So I decided to start a writing group. So I put since I didn't know anybody, I put a note up on, I can't remember the name of the app, but the app where you invite people to come to gatherings and things. And I went on that
Meetup.
and Meetup. There you go. Thank you. I put something on Meetup and I had a bunch of people show up. It was amazing. And it's so beautiful here in Maui. We could sit outside and listen to the birds and ride out there together. And we started out once a month and they kept wanting to go more. And we got up to twice a month and we were really liking it. And then the pandemic happened and that was the end of that. But I did take a writing group online. I said, it works so well with these people in person. I'll see if I can get people to come online. And in the meantime, my husband, Ron, had a really good friend. We were family friends. His name was Chappie. And Chappie and his wife lived just a couple blocks from us, and they were a lot younger than we were. But we just were really good friends. And a few months after Ron died, it turned out that Chappie died in his car on the way home from work. Just he hadn't been sick. Nobody thought that anything was going on, and he was just gone. And I was so worried about his wife that I decided that since I couldn't be there and go to her house and do things for her or with her like I would have had I lived there, I decided to write her a card every week for the first year with different things that I'd experienced in grief that I could help her with, or things that I had thought of, and different things like that. And before I started it, I thought, I've got to make sure I've got 52 different things that I can talk about.
Yes.
So I made a list, and I did easily come up with 52 different things that were perfect for this. So as a writer, I was looking at those 52 different things, and I thought, this is an outline for a book. So that was the beginning of my book. I hadn't started out intending to write a book, but that's how it came to be. And it actually turned into 2 different books, with each one of them having 26 chapters to make up the 52. And it was really wonderful. And finally, just a few months ago, I was able to get the cards published. And they come in a box of cards with what I wrote in that note on one side, with a beautiful watercolor around the edges. And then on the other side, each one of them has a different picture that I took on Maui, because I'm always taking pictures when I'm out for walks. And so it's all nature pictures, flowers and the beach and the forest and all the different places that I've been. And I have a picture of a different one on each card so they can turn it over and just see something really beautiful and hopefully be able to take a breath and relax. In addition to that, after I'd been doing this group online for a while, the writing group, I kept thinking something was missing. And it was before the second book came out. And I had read a book by Marcy Shimoff called Happy for No Reason after Jacques had died, and I really liked it. And I came across something online about Marcy Shimoff, and so I thought, well, I'll just look, because it really helped me before. I wonder what she's doing now. And it turned out that she had a Happy for No Reason certified training program. And I thought, wow, people don't think of grief and happiness together. And I think that that's vital, that people have to know they can be happy and grieve at the same time. And they can, as their grief is not so acute, they can be able to become more happy. And I decided I wanted to do something about that. So I ended up creating my own podcast called the Grief and Happiness Podcast. And our online writing group changed from just a writing group to a grief and happiness group. And gatherings we have every week, and we do some writing based on a prompt that I come up with that has to do with grief and love and all that sort of thing. And then and we talk about it. We talk in small groups, and then we come back together and we learn a happiness practice every week of something that they can do to help them put some joy back in their life at this point. And it's all of that's been very popular, and my podcast has been doing really well. It's considered in the top 5% of podcasts in the world. So I think I'm doing okay with that. And I want to reach people with it, and it looks like I am.
Congratulations. It's amazing to be able to be there and provide that community for individuals who are experiencing grief. Perhaps before we go further, why do we grieve? And it's such a simple question, but I'm sure you have some thoughts about it, and we do it in different ways. But first and foremost, what is grief? Is it just sadness, or is it more?
I think it's deeper than that. I think it's like if you got an arm cut off, you would experience that loss greatly, and it would profoundly change your life. And there would be all sorts of things you could do to help with it, but it wouldn't ever actually bring your arm back. And it's the same sort of thing with grieving somebody that you love deeply. It doesn't have to be a husband or a wife. It can be a parent or a child or a good friend, or it could be a loss of a different kind, because you grieve for lots of different kinds of loss. And if you look at it like, a part of me is gone. Like when your arm is cut off, that part of you is gone. When your loved one leaves, that part of you is gone, and you miss it, and you loved it, and it was a great part of your life, and how you did everything was connected to that. And you have to learn a new way to live, because things will never be the same. So the grieving is kind of a process of sadness at the beginning, but as you start coming out of it, it's a way to figure out, okay, now what? How do I go on? Hopefully you're saying, I can go on. I need some help and support in either getting started or figuring out how. And the gatherings that we do every week is that help and support, that community that you mentioned. Because community is vital in grief, so that people who get you can be with and talk. And that's an amazing thing.
We hear about this epidemic of loneliness in the so-called Western world. And this must be amplifying grief when you think about, how many people just don't have a support network as we used to. Maybe social media helps to some degree, but I don't see a lot of grief being shared on social media. It's mostly pictures of my vacation, or, this car that I just bought, or whatever, my feet next to an infinity pool. So people obviously need these outlets for their grief. And perhaps this is where the power of community comes in, groups such as yours. But you mentioned something really interesting, which is writing. And I hadn't thought of, I've thought a lot about narrative therapy, and it was something that was introduced to me a while back. But as a way of helping you heal after pain, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about the power of writing.
Oh, I'd be happy to. Writing has just been my saving grace. I don't know what I would have done without it. I truly don't. And a lot of the writing that happens after grief or during grief is telling your story. And it could be telling your story about lots of different things. And there's something about you need to express and experience that whole story before you can move forward. And I'll give you an example of that. When Jacques and I were married, he was a really happy, neat guy. It was fun to be around him. Everybody loved to be around Jacques. And he started getting cranky one weekend, just really, and that was not him. And I thought something's going on here because he's just being kind of weird. And it got worse through Saturday, and Sunday morning, he just was really bad. And I said, well, let me take your blood pressure, because I used to be a nurse too. That was one of my careers. I said, let me take your blood pressure. And it was sky high. And I said, something's wrong. I don't know what's wrong, but I think we need to go in and get it checked out. He absolutely refused, because he said, it's just high blood pressure, and he had some issues with high blood pressure, but not like this one. And the more I tried to talk him into doing something, the crankier he got. And finally, I called a friend of his who was a physician. They were really close friends. And I got him to call him at home, and he wasn't there. And he left a nasty message on the phone. And I don't think that the doctor's wife ever forgave me for that, or him for that, because it was pretty nasty. But that showed me that there was something terribly wrong, because that was not him. And so I thought, well, I know that this doctor works at an urgent care on weekends sometimes, then this might be his weekend at the urgent care. So I called the urgent care, and sure enough, he was there, and I told him what was going on. And he said, bring him over here now. And I said, no problem. I'd be happy to, because I knew he'd go see Mike, because they were good friends. And so I told him, Mike wants you to just come see him, and he'll figure this out with you, and everything will be better. And he finally got in the car he wanted to drive. I said, no, I don't think that's the best idea. So when we got to the urgent care, Mike was out with, I think, half of his staff in the parking lot waiting for us with a gurney and a nitroglycerin tablet. And gave it to him right away. And that whole thing that was just the beginning of the story that went through being hospitalized, having tests, finding out he was going to have bypass operation, going through the bypass operation, and then being able to come home. Everything in that had a story that could have been a book, because there were so many things. And people would ask me, because so many people knew him, they'd say, well, what happened? And my story would be so long, I could see that their eyes were glazing over, when I was talking to them, because I was giving them too much information. But I found that the more I told the story, the less I had to say. And finally, I got to the point where I said, well, he started having high blood pressure, and we got it checked out, and turned out he had blocked arteries, so he had heart surgery, and he's much better now. And that took a whole lot less time to tell that story than the one that I started telling you there. And I have discovered with my writing, and with working with writing with the other people that I work with, that the more they tell their story, whatever it is, and it can be just a small piece of what went on that they need to fix, like maybe they feel guilty over something that they did or didn't do, and they've got to, if they write through that, and really explore it in their writing and share it with somebody else and talk about it, then they can write it again, and it's much shorter. And they get to the point that, okay, I've dealt with that. All this stuff did happen. I've got it written down. If I ever need it for anything, I can refer back to it. But most of them put it someplace and never go back into it because it's giving them kind of a completion on telling those stories. And that it seems to help them so much.
As a writer, it makes a lot of sense. I'm interested in is there a particular process, or is it just really a case of a piece of paper and a pen or pencil and just write your thoughts, or would you suggest an actual structured approach?
I wouldn't suggest a structured approach because that puts pressure on them. And the last thing that they need is pressure of trying to do it right. I know I always used to want anything I wrote to be A-worthy, and if I wasn't going to get an A on it, I would just be, have to really work on it. And it caused lots of tension and stress. And they don't need that when they're doing this process. So what we do every gathering that we have when the people come together on Zoom, the first thing we do was I give them a writing prompt and they write about that. And then they break up into small groups, usually 3 people in a group. And they each can tell what they wrote to the other people in the group. And it will be, I find it's something totally different every time. I come up with something different every time, but all of it in some way or another relates to grief and relationships and love. And they always, all the time, they're so grateful for that particular subject because they said it's exactly what I needed this week. So I don't know that I was inspired to do it because they needed it, but I can tell you that at the end of those gatherings that we have every week, everybody's smiling. And so they're letting go of bits and pieces at a time as they're working through these things, because all of the things that I have them write have something about loss or grief in it that they can explore. But they're smiling by the end of it. And that makes me see that the process of the writing and of telling their story in bits and pieces like this is something that eventually the whole puzzle can come together and they can just think of the beauty and love and the relationship they had with whoever it was that died or whatever situation of loss that they were dealing with.
And so with each revision, you get closer and closer to that short, succinct version that you described before, so that you can actually describe, you've left a lot of the detail, you've let go of it, and you've given the event some level of meaning. I'm sure that's a big part of it, to just reconcile what's actually happened. And now you've got a clear, concise way of describing what happened and what it means to you. It makes a lot of sense.
It really does. And, when everybody's got that voice in their head that kind of bounces around and tells you things that you don't need to hear a lot of the time. And when you go through this sort of a thing, you can figure out how to not give into that voice in your head. If it's starting to bother you, then you just get out your journal and write something. Instead of having the voice keep saying, you did that wrong, or you shouldn't have done that, or you wouldn't have died if you would have done this, or, that sort of thing. Write it down. And you don't have to write it down over and over again. Usually you write it down, and then if you need to write a little more on it, you will, but then you'll work your way through it and it's gone.
Do people, in your experience, blame themselves a lot after these types of events?
It depends on what it is. It depends on the circumstances. And there's a lot of shame and blame. A lot of different emotions that come up and different things. And I had a huge one with Ron because since Ron, or my husband Jacques, had been on dialysis. Both my husbands had heart failure that led to renal failure, which led to dialysis. And Jacques' trip with the dialysis was extremely difficult, with multiple hospitalizations and all kinds of problems and complications. And he was miserable for the last year and a half of his life. And I thought, gee, if he just wasn't on dialysis, I knew as a nurse that it takes about a week generally before you stop dialysis. So it'd be similar if your kidneys just shut down, and it's a gradual, peaceful, beautiful way to die. And had we been able to have that conversation, things maybe could have been different for Jacques so that he wouldn't have had to suffer so much. So when Ron and I got together, before I knew Ron had the same problem with, heart failure and then renal failure, I didn't know that he had those problems yet when we started having this conversation. He seemed perfectly healthy. And he said, well, what happened with Jacques? So I told him the whole long story. And I said, what I have learned from that experience is that I'm not going on dialysis. That it's just something to prolong your life, but not necessarily in a good way. You can't do the things you want to do or go the places you want to go, be with the people you want to be with. Your life just changes drastically. And so I said, I don't want it. And Ron said, you know what? I don't either. I don't want to live that way. That's when your kidneys shut down, that's a signal that it's time for you to die. And that's okay, because everybody has to die sometime. And we were both okay with that. And we had told some people, and they said, oh, no, how could you do that? And I said, very easily. People that don't know they're dying from renal failure do it all the time. And I have seen it happen with people with my medical background, that it's kind of a beautiful way to go. And Ron got put on dialysis in a very bad situation, because his doctor had just told him that he was doing really well. With his nephrologist had told him that, and that he could just not come back for another month or two to see the doctor instead of the closer regular visits we'd been having, because he said he was doing so well. And they did lab work that day when he was at the doctor's office. And when on the weekend, he was taking his wife on an airplane to a faraway place to have a vacation. And when he was in the airport, he was looking at his patient's lab reports and stuff, and he called his nurse, and the doctor and the nurse both knew Ron's wishes of not going on dialysis. Both of them knew. And he told his nurse, you've got to call him and tell him that they've got to go to the hospital now so he can start dialysis. And she said, he doesn't want that. And he said he's got to be able to make the decision and not just, not want it, but to be able to do that. And Ron didn't want to go. And I said, okay, but, since your labs were so good just a few days ago, it's so much better than they had been, I thought it'd be a good idea, because lab the errors can be made. I said it could be there was an error made in this case. And so we went to the hospital, and they didn't let me go back with him, which I usually did. And that was frustrating under the circumstances. But the next thing I know, I found out that they had wheeled him into a room and hooked him up to dialysis without really explaining to him what they were doing or why they were doing it or anything. And once you get on dialysis, you can't go off. When you go off, it's a death sentence, that it won't take that long. It'll be a few days to a week. They weren't telling him what they were doing. It was really, with all the regulations and everything you have to sign and everything, consents you have to give and everything, for him to get through all of that and then find out that after they had actually done it, they said, well, we can tell you about it now, because it's not an emergency. It was an emergency before, and we had to do it right then. We didn't have time to talk to you. That doesn't work. That was just wrong. We had the legal documents. We had with a lawyer to get all the things that were signed, and the hospital had a copy of it, and I had a copy of it that said that he did not want to go on dialysis, and that I was the one that's supposed to make decisions for him if he couldn't. And they didn't talk to me, and he could have made the decisions had he been asked. They didn't talk to me, they didn't talk to him, and they didn't follow the directions. But then he was in this position. Okay, do you want to die right now, or do you want to? And so he chose to go on with dialysis, and it was a long and painful journey, and had lots of complications. And every time something had happened, I would just say, why didn't we just do what we had planned to do? And there's a lot of guilt in something like that. even though reflecting on it, I don't know how I could have done anything differently, and except for not driving him to the hospital, that could have been different. But we really both thought that we needed the reassurance that it was a faulty lab test. And when it wasn't, then we were kind of stuck. So there are so many different things that can happen, like the parents who give their child a car for their 16th birthday, and the first time they get in it, they get in a wreck, and that's it. And those parents are going to feel guilty forever, even though they didn't cause the accident. They didn't have anything to do with that, but they feel like they facilitated it. So there are all kinds of different ways that people can die, like the case recently where we had a school shooter who was underage and the parents had given him a gun. And I think the father's still on trial, but the mother was guilty and is going to be for allowing him to have, or giving him that gun, allowing him to have it and not watching to see that he took it to school. We're starting to see in the U.S. anyway, that we're starting to see that people have to take responsibility. And it's been a long road here in the U.S. to try to get that done.
Absolutely. Why can saying yes make us happier?
Well, it made me happier. And I've always was kind of somebody had asked me something, I'd say no first before I even thought about it, because I thought I don't need one more thing to do or one more responsibility or anything like that. So I would just automatically say no. And about a year after Jacques died, it was New Year's was coming, and I thought, well, I need to make a resolution because I've got to change my life, because I'm sitting here on the couch every night by myself, not doing anything. I didn't want to go out of the house by myself. I just wasn't doing anything. And so I meditated on it quite a bit. And what came to me was to accept invitations. And I thought, well, that's not me. I don't usually do that. But the more I thought about it, I thought, I haven't been getting any invitations since Jacques died. And I need to do something about that, but I didn't know what it was. So what I did was decide that my intention for that year was to say yes when somebody invited me to do something. And the world opened up to me. I had so many opportunities that I don't think I would have had before, because I would go into things with kind of a negative mindset that I don't have time, or I don't want to, or I'm not interested, or that sort of a thing. But just saying yes for legitimate questions. Like the first thing that happened was the editorial board at the newspaper needed more members, and they invited me. I had written a letter to the editor that was a big thing published in the paper, not just a little thing, but they made a big deal out of it. And so because of that, they invited me to be on the editorial board. And I didn't know anything about journalism, even though I taught writing and communications, but I didn't really know about journalism and wasn't sure that was the thing for me to do. But I had agreed to say yes, and so I did. And it was a year-long position, a very big county that had lots of diversity in what went on and what they dealt with and what would go in the paper. And it was fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating. I met people I never would have met under any other circumstances. I had lots of opportunities because I did it. And I felt I was doing a service to the community. And then more things just kept pouring in, so that year I did things that I never thought I'd do. Like I was on the crew for a ultra marathon bicycle race for a team that was on that race going from the West Coast to the East Coast of the U.S. And they got there in less than a week, which is pretty amazing. Because there were just two guys on the team, and they broke the record that they'd set before, and they broke the guy that I was working with specifically had broken a record every time he'd gone there, except for this time, because this time when he got way high up in the Rocky Mountains, he got pneumonia. And I was the nurse in charge, and we had to call an ambulance, and the people thought that his lab tests were showing that he had a heart attack. And I said, no, that's not what they're showing. He's an ultra marathon athlete. And what happens when you do that is things change with your heart. And it looks like your heart is being damaged, but that's just the way it works. And of course, they wouldn't listen to me because I wasn't a doctor. So, but he ended up having to drop out of the race. But the whole process and going through all that was an amazing experience. I went to Puerto Rico, where my son-in-law's from, and I'd always wanted to go there and see what it was like. It was an amazing trip, and it just happened to get there 2 days before my daughter and her husband had planned to come. I had no idea that we were going to be there at the same time, but they said, well, just hang out with us. So I got to meet all of his relatives and got to do all these family things with his family that I never dreamed that was going to happen. It was just a coincidence. And I got to go to South Africa with a couple of friends because I was asking my friend what she was doing that summer because we worked at the university and had the summer off. And she said, well, I'm going to take my sister to South Africa. And I said, oh, that sounds great. She said, come with us. And I said, oh, got to say yes. And I did. And I'm so glad. It was absolutely amazing. And that's just a few of the things that happened that year. And the year before, nothing had happened like that because I wasn't open to the questions, and I would have said no if somebody would have asked me. But when I learned to say yes to things, my whole life opened up. Probably the most exciting year of my life was that year of saying yes. And after that, I didn't say yes to absolutely everything. There's some things that you don't need to say yes to. And I learned that in the process too. And now I lead a much more balanced life. It's like coming to Maui. Before that, that experience was afterwards. But I was surprised at myself when I said yes when my husband wanted to move here because I'd always lived in California. All my friends lived there, my family, everybody was there, and I was walking away from all of that. And it was an incredibly good decision for me. I'm so grateful to be here.
Sounds like you're saying yes to yourself and you're saying no to being isolated and being alone, and you're just allowing, when the universe or reality opens these doorways, these invitations, I think it's something so many of us can do more of, especially if we're sitting alone saying, I don't have a network, I've got no opportunities, blah, 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 blah. You're probably saying no to a whole lot more than you need to.
Mm-hmm.
Such a great approach. What is something you should never say to someone who is grieving?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think that the number one thing that people say that is, I wish they wouldn't, is I'm sorry for your loss. And that's because everybody says it. It's like the grocery store clerks that say have a nice day when they haven't even looked you in the eye when they've been checking you out. It's just something that people do by rote because they think that they're supposed to say that when they first see somebody who's lost someone. And you hear it so many times, and me, I've heard it twice as many times, that it's like, you're not being sincere. Tell me the truth, whatever it is. Say something real. And things that you say like, oh, he's in a better place now. And I would think, I think my place is better than wherever he is. I want him here, not off in some better place. That one bothers me. Or one of them is God needed another angel. Well, probably not as much as I needed a husband. He's got a whole lot of angels up there. Those kind of questions, when you really think about what you're saying, you can see that, oh, well, maybe that wasn't a real good thing to say. And because of that, the good thing to say, I don't want to leave you with all this just negativity here, is talk about the person who died. I would have people come up and say to me, I just love Jacques. He was the best teacher I ever had. Or I loved his singing voice, and I'd go any place I heard he was singing, or any play that he was in, I'd make sure I was there because I just loved his acting and his singing. Saying something like that, that's wonderful. That feels so good. They'd tell me how Ron changed their life by suggestions he made and what they were doing. And that came a lot of times. I would hear that. So don't have to know the other person that well to be specific. You can just say, I'm sure you really miss him. And they'll probably say they do. And you can say something like, well, I'd be happy to come sit with you whenever you'd like. You don't have to talk, just I'll be here with you. And if there's anything I can do, I really mean it. I will do it if I see something, because so many people ask these people, just let me know what I can do. Well, they're not going to call you. They don't need to be worried about thinking, what could that person do? And we found that when we did make calls, Jacques had been sick for so long, and it was back before cell phones and a lot of other things when he was sick. And we ran out of groceries in the house because I couldn't take him grocery shopping with me, and I couldn't leave him by himself. And so I tried to either get somebody to come sit with Jacques while I went to get groceries, or somebody to get groceries so that we'd have food to eat. And nobody answered the phone, and nobody replied to the messages. We knew tons of people, and almost all of them had said, just let me know if you need anything. And I was just shocked that none of them picked up the phone or showed up with a casserole or anything. So don't make promises you can't keep. Don't expect the person who's grieving to do something for you to make you feel better. And be kind in the process. If you can do something like it, the person needs to walk their dog and they're feeling really low, go over and say, here, can I walk your dog? I'd really love to walk your dog. Or if you're making a casserole and you make too much, bring it over, whether they wanted it or not. And have it don't take up a big casserole. That's one thing. If you take a great big casserole to one person, that's kind of wasteful. But you could take that same casserole and cut it in individual servings and wrap them up so they could be stored in the freezer. And that would be handy, because then they could have what they needed whenever they needed it.
I think we're all so afraid, and I'm not sure why we're afraid of someone else's grief. Is it because we don't want to see them burst out in tears, or we think it must be so painful to be reminded? But what you're saying is actually just be real, be authentic. Mm-hmm. They're still the same person, and say something that you really mean. If you don't have anything meaningful to say, maybe just don't say it. Don't make promises that you're not going to keep, and say, I'm here for you, man, or whatever it is. Rather, say something meaningful. And I think about people that have been important to me. If someone had said, wow, your grandfather was an amazing person, that means so much more than I'm sorry for your loss.
Mm-hmm.
So do that.
1,000,000 times more,
Important. What role does gratitude play in dealing with loss?
That's really interesting, because I've had people say to me, what do I have to be grateful for? My husband died, or whoever it was that died. Well, there's lots. How about all of your other loved ones who are still around? You can be grateful for them. Grateful that you still have a sister you can visit with, or that your parents are still alive, or that there's something you can be grateful about. And that's what you need to focus on, is the good and beautiful things. And when somebody first told me about it, I had a couple of friends that were trying to get me to watch the movie The Secret, and I thought that's not my kind of thing. And finally, one of them brought it over to my house and said, we're going to watch this now. Okay. And in the end, when I went to put it away, there was a paper with it that said, write down 10 things you're grateful for. And I thought, well, I'm just going to do that, because it's just going to prove to me that I don't have anything to be grateful for. So I started writing, and I got out another piece of paper, and I kept writing, because I kept finding things, realizing all there was in the world I was grateful for. And I actually kind of got hooked on it, trying to write something different every time. And I'd be standing in the line at the bank and dig through my purse for a receipt that I could write on the back of it, so that I wouldn't forget that I was grateful for that one thing. And I discovered that there's a never-ending realm of gratitude for most people. And I really enjoy the process of gratitude today. To this day, I write in a journal every day. And two of the things that I write are at least three things that I'm grateful for. And it can't be the same thing all the time. You got to come up with things that you're grateful for. And sometimes I say, well, I can't stop with three because I have to write these other two too. And so I'll do that. And then the other thing I write every day is write something that brought you joy the day before. Because a lot of times when people are grieving, they don't think they can be happy or that they'll ever feel joy about anything again. And I don't have a problem finding something every day that I experienced joy about. And that feels really good. And it brings you up when you get in the habit of doing this, of looking at your gratitude, looking at your joy, writing in your journal so you can tell your story, which is incredibly important. They're just, there's not the time left over to sit around and feel sorry for yourself. And I'm not saying that that's bad, because in grief, there's a certain amount of that you're going to do. So don't feel guilty about it. But you'll find that you have less and less time on the couch or wherever it is that you don't do anything. And when you focus on what's good about your life.
That's a great tool. And for those who are interested in my work at the Resilience Institute, we found multiple studies that show that gratitude as a practice actually improves sleep quality, believe it or not, because it activates the parasympathetic nervous system. You can't help but go into that rest and digest state when you're acknowledging the things that have gone well. It's such a simple tool. And eventually, I suppose, that positivity that you're generating and noticing in your life starts to displace some of that grief, which leads me to ask you, is there a time limit on grief? Should people aim for a certain amount of time or let it run its course?
Well, the answer to that is no. That with grief, as long as you love someone, you'll be grieving them if they're not here with you. I know my parents died a long time ago, and I still am grieving. It's a different kind of grief. The kind of grief I have now is, boy, I wish I could have told him that, or boy, I wish she could have tasted that thing I baked, or that sort of thing. It's not the deep kind of grief from when they first died. But there's things about missing them that I'll grieve. I know I'll grieve them forever. I know I'll grieve both of my husbands forever. And I've had people question me on that. They said, well, how can you choose one over the other? I said, I'm not choosing one over the other. It's nothing like that. I loved both my husbands. And they'd make another comment, and I'd say, how many kids do you have? Because, you can love 10 kids if you have 10 kids, and there's no problem. So if I have two husbands, I can love two husbands. It's not like we were married at the same time, but
Exactly.
So it's I believe that you start moving forward in your grief, things change, things get better, they get lighter. The more you actively participate in self-care, the sooner that will happen. And ultimately, you'll get to the point where you can say, gee, it would have been fun if Ron could have been here for that, or I know what he would have said right now. And that's a kind of grief, but it's kind of beautiful.
Does acknowledging the fact that grief will play a role in all of our lives encourage us to live more fully now? What are your thoughts on that?
I hope so. I really do, because I've dealt a lot with death when I was young. My dad bought an ambulance company when I was 13 years old, and at that time you only had to be 14 years old to go on ambulance calls. That's how long ago it was. And you had to have first aid training, and my dad was a first aid trainer for the community, so he made sure that I would be able to go on calls because he was always needing somebody to go on calls. And I saw the most gruesome deaths because it was back before seatbelt requirements, and people would be thrown out of cars and all sorts of things like that. I saw so much death, and we used to take people to the mortuary. The ambulances aren't allowed to do that anymore, but in those days, the ambulances did take people to the mortuary. So I'd be taken, going to the mortuary. How many 14-year-old kids do you know that go to the mortuary on a regular basis? So I started encountering a lot of death at a very young age. And so I've got kind of a different perspective on it than other people. But for me, it made me realize, especially when I see, or it was one of my friends that died. One of them smothered in a silo on a farm. He just fell in, and that was it. And it was an accident. He just slipped and fell in, and his life was over. And another one was in a group of car. Actually, I had two different sets of friends, one set of girls and one set of boys. Different places in the state, didn't have anything to do with each other, but within like a year of each other, they had run into the side of the car, or side of a train, and killed everybody in the car. And it was right when I was graduating from high school that happened. And that's young to be, that's kind of a big quantity of death all of a sudden for that to happen. So
Really
I think the more you see of it, the more you realize how fragile life really is. You never know when the next day is going to be, or the next moment is going to be your last moment. So it's really important to savor everything that you can experience and focus on good experiences, whatever they are, whatever you love to do, whoever you love to be with, do it. Just, live your best life, and everything will be a whole lot better for you.
great message. I love that idea of savoring the moment and practicing some of those tools like gratitude while your loved ones are still with you, while you're still with your loved ones. How can people find out more and connect with you?
The easiest way is I have two websites, but the easiest one is griefandhappiness.com. Just remember that. And my email's on there. You can contact me through email. The links to my books, the Grief and Happiness Handbook, the Grief and Happiness Cards, and Loving and Living Your Way Through Grief are all on that website. And the gatherings, how to go to the gatherings on Zoom, they don't cost anything, because my friends got together and created a nonprofit organization so they could support all the work that I'm doing, which I think is pretty amazing. But the more they saw what I was doing, the more interested they got in it, and they've been happy to be involved in this. And we always need more people involved in the nonprofit association. There's lots of things that you can do to serve and help other people.
Well, we'll make sure that all of those links are in the show notes. Everyone do click on those links and connect with Emily and the work that she's doing. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we sign off?
Well, I'm so grateful that you gave me the opportunity to come here, because I think that the more I talk about it, the more people listen to it, the happier lives that people can have. And that's pretty special. I feel really good about that. So thank you for the opportunity.
My pleasure. Thank you. And I certainly have learned a few very useful tools today, including that what to say to someone who's experiencing grief. I would have said, and almost did say, sorry for your loss when you talked about what happened to both of your husbands. And it's not authentic. And so if I take one thing away, it's to be authentic with people, especially during those times.
Yes.
So thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure our readers will too. And our listeners.
Our listeners.
And your readers when they get your book. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Okay, thank you so much.